At this time, go to speaker view, and Patty Andrus from Alpha Delta chapter will now introduce tonight's presenter. So I'll turn it over to Patty.
Well, Lindsay Burns is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Teaching and Learning at The Ohio State University. Prior to returning to grad school, Lindsay taught middle school and high school math and science in Southern Ohio for 9 years. Upon graduation with her PhD, as someone mentioned, Lindsay will begin working as an evaluation specialist for NASA's Office of STEM Engagement. And Lindsay is a member of Alpha Delta.
You can go, Lindsay.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me tonight. I am going to share my screen. I have a presentation to go along with my discussion this evening. So at this point, you should all be able to see my title slide. So integrated STEM education, what, how, and why. So I will take a minute and to elaborate a little bit on what I'm currently doing. So I did teach for 9 years, K-12. I taught 6th grade, 8th grade, and 9th grade. In my last year of teaching, I was offered the opportunity to be a part of a team who created an integrated STEM program for grades 5 through 8 in the district I taught in. And I was put in charge basically of the 8th grade program. So I was the teacher, but I was able to create the entire curriculum, implementation, all of that. So it was a really, really awesome experience and what ultimately led me to go back to grad school. So I started at Ohio State 3 years ago as a PhD student. And my main area, I guess, is science, although I do spend a lot of time studying integrated STEM. I've taught an integrated STEM class at the university level. And my research is actually in informal science institutions. So places like zoos or aquariums, science centers, science museums, or children's museums. So that's where my dissertation research is found. That's the area. So I'm really excited to speak with you this evening about integrated STEM. It's kind of a newer term in the grand scheme of things, and really, really important to me. So I'm excited to share it with you this evening. If you do have any questions, there'll definitely be time at the end. If you want to put questions in the chat, I can also get to those from there too. So whatever you would prefer. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what is STEM, an acronym I'm sure many of you have heard before, but if not, we're going to talk about what it is. What is integrated STEM? How is integrated STEM employed in K-12 education currently? STEM in higher ed and teacher prep. So I have had some experience with working with pre-service teachers that are working on their teaching degree, and we have had the opportunity to teach a class in the higher ed level for integrated STEM. So I'm going to speak to that. Why is STEM important? And then I've also added at the end ISI, so informal science institutions in STEM, and how this fits into my current research as a doctoral candidate. So what is STEM? STEM is an acronym, very simply, that stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It is understood in a little bit different ways at different levels. Originally, it was just simply the acronym, like just a way for us to kind of group these things together because they are so interrelated in the field, like once people get to working. And it became a little bit more well-known when the National Science Foundation started funding STEM projects in the 1990s. Now, the National Science Foundation gives out millions of dollars worth of grants every year for research. And they actually have an entire branch known as AZLE, which has a lot to do with, the acronym is AZLE, but it has a lot to do with STEM education and informal science. So that's where a lot of those grants come from. And that's when STEM started to really take off. Now we see it on, I don't know if you've seen it, but like on children's toys, like I have 2 children, they're 7 and 10. So you'll see like STEM toys. STEM is highlighted in activities that kids can sign up for. And it's also really important in schools and in informal science. Whoops. There we go. Okay, so this is a quote from some research where integration in teacher ed across all subject areas, not just the STEM content areas, but across the content areas has become really important in the last few years. This is from 2005, but the part that I highlighted is really important to to this idea of integration and what it means to integrate. And it says the fundamental argument to support curriculum integration is that learning in itself is in itself the making of connections. And it's really important to consider the fact that we don't experience content in a silo or on its own by itself in the real world. It's not just not how we live life, right? Like we don't do math separate from other things or science separate from technology. So we see that we've experienced them integrated. And so when I started to teach my integrated STEM class to 8th graders, I had a really hard time with, why are we doing math and science? Or why are we writing in science? The first time I asked them to write a 5-paragraph essay. So it was important to me to show the students that, we don't, just because we teach the classes that way so that we can focus on specific content does not mean that they exist without one another. And that's what this idea of integration, it becomes really important. So what is integrated STEM? Integrated STEM is teaching science, technology, engineering, and mathematics together in combinations. Now I'm going to talk about some specific combinations this evening in regards to the way that teachers can plan for integrated STEM lessons. But one of the things that's really important to the idea of integrated STEM is it uses authentic problem solving to show content and process. So not only are we considering the standards and those kind of the checklist of things that we need to teach, but we're also considering the process used to understand and to learn about those things originally. So when I think about process, how many of you remember learning about the scientific method when you were in school? Yeah, I see some head nods. So the scientific method is something that we still teach. It's something that's still very relevant and important to what we do in science class. But one of the things that students struggle with the scientific method is that it's very linear when it's presented, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, or 7, or however many steps the one that you're using has, and then it's over. Then the scientific method is done. Well, what we need to consider when we talk about the scientific method that way is that's not really actually how it works, right? Scientists go through the process of asking a question, doing research, testing whatever their hypothesis is, and then communicating their results to other scientists who then can repeat the process. One of the things that has become very important to integrated STEM is the engineering design process. And it's one of the ways that engineering really becomes evident and kind of visible within this integration. And one of the things that I love about it is how cyclical it is and how it's presented that way. So this is just an example. This is from teachengineering.org. There's also a website that's very specific to elementary. It's called Engineering is Elementary, and it's presented in a way that's relevant to elementary students. But this is used to define or ask a question or define a problem. And then instead of testing something and then reporting results, you are creating a solution of some sort. So some sort of a prototype, testing that prototype, getting feedback on the prototype, and then communicating your results to others. It also asks for this idea that you can improve or redesign what your original prototype is and make changes to it. And that's really important in science. The nature of science is something that's not always easily communicated. And so the nature of science is how science changes over time and how we learn new things, and how what we knew yesterday may not be what we know today, and that's okay. And that we can use that information to keep moving forward. And so the engineering design process helps to communicate that in terms of creating a prototype, getting feedback on it, and then recreating or improving your design. So earlier I mentioned that I was going to speak to the different combinations of integration. And they're kind of a hierarchy. It starts with maybe the least amount of integration and goes to the most amount of integration. So there's 4 of them. The first one is cross-disciplinary integration. And this is a single discipline with connections applied to show context. So this is still, I'm going to teach science in science class, but maybe I'm going to reference another content area to show how it fits. But the class content standards are still the goal. So my science standards would still be the goal, but maybe I'm going to mention how it would fit into math, or maybe I'm going to mention how you might write about it in English, or maybe I mention the historical considerations of like when this was discovered, but my science content is still my focus. Multidisciplinary is when a single topic is taught in multiple subjects, but the subjects still focus on their own application. So this is If a group of teachers, like a team of teachers, were to take an overall arching theme, and they each teach to that theme in their own class, but they're all teaching about the same theme, but they're focused on their own content standards. So what's important about this is students are expected to still make their own connection. So even though the theme is the same throughout, students are still, they still are understood to make those connections on their own. In interdisciplinary integration, the larger idea or skill set is explicitly connected to another subject or discipline. A lot of times when this is implemented, you'll have teachers that are team teaching, or they come up with an overall project together, and then it's taught in both classes or more than two. But they focus on each other's content standards also, not just their own. So they make the connections explicit for students. They tell them how they're making these connections. And then finally, transdisciplinary is there are no subject area boundaries. So this would be a project that would probably take a significant amount of time. And it would be more about, okay, here's our problem, and now let's figure out how we're going to solve it using whatever content we need to. So authentic problem solving is going to be really important, especially in transdisciplinary. So in higher education and teacher prep, this is something that has come up and is coming up more often. And it's this idea of integrated pedagogical content knowledge. So pedagogical content knowledge is something that's been researched a lot. It's the idea that not only do teachers need to understand the content that they're teaching, but they also need to understand how to teach it. And it's not just about understanding the process of maybe completing a math problem or having the knowledge of facts, but it's also about understanding how students may experience the content, anticipating the challenges that students might have, and already having plans in place to support those students. So integrated pedagogical content knowledge, or IPCK, is an idea where Weinberg and Sample McMeeking were like, okay, well, if we're going to do this integration, then teachers need to have the pedagogical content knowledge of how the content interacts and how students might make connections initially, and if there are specific supports that students would need in order to make the connections to integrate the content. So this was something that when I had the opportunity to teach a class that I'm going to speak to next at Ohio State, it was something that we wanted to make sure was clear to our pre-service teachers. So these were teachers who were in their senior year of our program at Ohio State. So they were getting ready to do their full-time student teaching. And we had the opportunity to create a class for them with an elective class. They had already taken their method courses. And this class in particular allowed them the time to create integrated lessons with their peers whose focus were in other content areas. So these students were all middle childhood education majors. And so middle childhood education is, their licenses are grades 4 through 9. And they choose 2 content areas. So my teaching license is 4 through 9 math and science. So we had student teachers who had all 4 all 4 content areas were represented. And so for each week, we moved through those different levels of integration that I just spoke to. With each week, we moved through those, and we created an experience or a theme that they were going to use to then plan their lessons. So the first theme was there's a paleontology museum on campus. There's a full-time paleontologist who works there. He's the curator. And so he gave a presentation about how they can calculate the stride of a dinosaur and then how big the dinosaurs were based on their stride. And so we listened to his presentation, and the students spent the next 2 weeks creating an integrated lesson around that content. And they paired themselves up with students who had other content areas than what they had. The second set of, so this was 3 weeks at a time. We have 12-week classes at OSU. The second set of 3 weeks was glass blowing. So we actually went to a glass blowing place in Columbus. And we spent time researching the background of how glass is made, what glass is used for, all of those different things. The students did that. We got to go to this place, blow glass, have that experience, and then they were able to create these integrated lessons from that. We also spent an evening at Kings Island. So the students were did a lot with physics for that week, a lot of physics and math. And then finally, we were able to get, we got a tour and had access to the OSU airport, and we were able to use their flight simulators that they use for the pilot school at OSU. And then they were able to create lessons on flight. And it was really amazing to see these students work with one another and collaborate, learn content from one another that's maybe wasn't their focus, and create these really amazing lessons for students that showed the students how these content areas are connected. Because they were student teaching the following semester. So this was fall semester of 2 years ago now. And since they were student teaching last spring, they were able to implement these lessons with students. And we had contact with them throughout the spring, and they were really, really excited with the way students reacted to them. It was amazing. So one of the reasons why I am so absolutely passionate about this was my experience with teaching integrated STEM my last year of teaching before I went back to grad school. And I had a curriculum director at the time said, if you can dream it, we'll figure it out. And I really wanted my students to have these experiences that they might not otherwise have. And I wanted it to be something super memorable for them. And so I chose 2 overarching topics. I had my students for a semester at a time for STEM, 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. And I chose 2 overarching topics. The first topic was the ocean, and the second topic was space. And then all of the content standards that I had, plus the integration that I had chosen, connected to those 2 areas. Well, the very first day, I had a student who was like, Mrs. Burns, this is great, but I've never even seen the ocean. And it was like a sucker punch. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. And so one of the things that I decided is that we had to create an experience so that they would be able to understand what I was talking about. So we did have virtual reality headsets, which was amazing. And that was really cool, but it just wasn't quite good enough. And so through some of my courses that I had taken previously, I had some connections to the National Aquarium in Baltimore. So I took my students to Assateague Island, which is in Maryland. And then we spent the night at the National Aquarium in Baltimore, and we did a STEM like overnight. And so one of the things that they did was they talked to us about all the animals. We had a tour behind the scenes. They have a dolphin exhibit there. So they were able to create enrichment for the dolphins. So basically toys that the dolphins play with. And they worked through all these things. Well, then when we came home, I was able to connect all these different things to this experience that all 52 of my students had had. And one of the things that we did was we talked about how even in Ohio, the ocean is really important to us. And even, I had 8 students who had never seen the ocean, and most of my other students who had been went on vacation. They're like, Mrs. Burns, the ocean is so far away. Like, how is what we're doing affecting the ocean? So we talked a lot about ocean literacy. And then we created, we talked about different problems with oceans. What are some, and a lot came up about all the plastic that's in ocean, all the trash that is in oceans. And so one of the problems that they had to solve was they had to create an ocean pollution device that would help to collect pollution from the ocean. We tested them, we presented them at board meetings. So these are just some of the things. So not only did we talk about science, we talked about the engineering, about the building, we talked about the technology. There's a lot of websites, especially the NOAA website, the National Oceanic and Aquatic Administration. They have buoys like out all over the world that have water, temperature, wind speed, all these different things. So we graphed all of that. So we did a ton of math. We looked at the history of like ocean exploration. So that's just one example. My students at that point too, when 9/11 rolled around, like those students that year were born in 2001. So one of the things that we did that year, I don't know how many of you are aware, but when they cleaned up the World Trade Center, the steel that was left over, they melted it down and created the USS New York, which is a battleship in the Navy. And so we talked about like how they reused those materials and then created this thing to help represent what had happened. And then what I did was I took materials that are recyclable, all kinds of things, plastic, aluminum, I don't even know, all kinds of things, threw them out all over the desks and asked the students to pick out pieces of trash, things that could be recycled, and to create a boat. It had to float. We put Lego cargo in it to see could hold the most, all of those things. But it was a way that we could do engineering, we could do science, we did math, we calculated how much weight they held. And then we also talked about history. And so these were just some of the examples of projects that I was able to do, but it's those things, those experiences with my students that really pushed me to want to do more in this part of education with integration and also with informal science. So I realized that my students' experiences at the aquarium, I was also able to take a group to space camp 2 years ago, which was absolutely amazing. I think I loved it more than they did. It was one of those once in a lifetime things, but just those experiences that they maybe wouldn't have had otherwise really pushed me to go back to school. And so when we talk about why is integration important, like I wanted to be able to continue to grow my knowledge of what it means for things to be integrated, how I can have an impact on students in other ways. This idea of authentic problem solving, like what it means to put things in front of students that mean something to them and that they know that they can do something with it later. The idea of process, I think that's become very, very evident over the last year with all the things that we've had to experience. This idea of how science is learned and how we continue to learn more about it. And it's not just about the facts that we already know, but it's about the process of how we learn those facts. And then also communication, like how can we communicate what we know and our knowledge with each other and creating a path of communication for my students, that they felt like they were scientists and that they could communicate what they had learned too. Which led me to ISIs and STEM. So ISI stands for Informal Science Institution. The definition that I currently use in my research is zoos, aquarium, science centers, science museums, and the parts of children's museums that have science related content. And then there's also outdoor spaces like botanical gardens or the Columbus area, well, across the state, but I know the Columbus area is the one I've experienced because we're in Southern Ohio, but like the metro parks, they have a lot of outreach and those would also be considered informal science institutions. So what I decided to do for my dissertation was to study how immersiveness is defined in these institutions and how we can create STEM related experiences for students and then how that ultimately affects their learning. So I am currently in the final stages. My dissertation was actually approved yesterday, so that was really cool. So I defend my dissertation on April 7th, so I'm almost there. And then when I go to work for NASA, my job will be to evaluate the grants that are given to, there's a set of universities that one of their goals is to increase the minority representation in STEM. And so my job will be we have someone who works with those institutions to create the programs, and then I help them to evaluate what they're doing and how it's working. So I'm really, really excited to get started with that. So, okay, I just talked a million miles a minute, but that's my presentation. Let me see if there's anything in the chat that I need to address. Okay, does anyone have any questions?
I do.
Okay.
I know that they've recently moved STEM to STEAM
Mhm.
and have added the arts. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, my husband's a band director, so the arts have a very, very special place in my heart. I was a music minor in college, so I always included the arts, even though they weren't necessarily always part of the acronym. And I'll be honest with you, I think because, you know, there's STEM, STEAM, STREAM, like some people put the R in for reading. I think most people stick with STEM because that's where the funding comes from. But I think that those things are always part of the picture. So when my students, when we had to, like part of the final presentation was always some written something, right, to talk about their work. They always had to create some sort of a draft of their protocol in picture format. I think the arts are really important. One of the things that actually my husband and I worked on last year for his class was they created, they had to tune and measure and make like little windpipes that they had to like blow on, and they had to like measure them out and tune them. So that was a STEM project that we did in his band class. So I mean, I absolutely think the most important piece for me is the integration. Like, let's show students that these things are connected, that they don't need to be isolated. We do have to teach the standards. I saw someone ask a question about the standards. So yeah, they're really, really important. When I taught 8th grade, my students still had to take the 8th grade science test. So I still had to make sure that I was addressing those standards. And so what I did with my 8th graders that year was like with the ocean, we talked about plate tectonics. Like that's a big part of 8th grade science curriculum. Like we talked about that, but the title of the unit was the ocean floor. And so I used the ocean floor, as kind of like my talking points at the beginning, and everything related back. So you definitely, we can't just forget about the standards, and I understand that completely. But I also think too that, like you mentioned, Diana, like we're not gonna, I think including the arts, including reading, including these other pieces, no matter which acronym you use, is definitely important. Because I think social studies, like the history piece, was huge with what I did. And it's not really part of the acronym, but we were always talking about like, well, who were the first people to look at this, and what are the other, because talking about what people have done before you, right, and using what other people have done, like that's so important, especially to science and what we do in science. So I see some other questions. Have you been able to see an increase of Hannah, are you talking about with my work at NASA? I can't see everyone, so if you're answering, I'm not sure. I actually haven't started yet. I just got the job offer on Tuesday. So I can get back to you on that. I hope so. How did you work with other teachers? Okay, so that's a really excellent question. Not everyone is open to this idea of these big projects that overlap with other content areas. And it's a hard thing to balance, because we all have things that we have to do and have to accomplish, and standards to teach. But I think what was important for me is thinking about how I could support other teachers. So I did spend a lot of time talking with them about what standards we could cover, what I could address in STEM that would also help support their class. So when I had my students write their papers, their essays, I went to my friends that taught language arts. I'm like, okay, how do you explain a 5-paragraph essay? What are the things that you require of your students when they write these essays? I had them start writing in MLA format, which is what the high school teachers, I went to the high school teachers and said, what, do you use APA, MLA, what format do you want them to cite things in? So it does take a lot of work to kind of reach out to all these different people. But then when I had big projects to do, people would get excited about them and then would want to be involved. It was also very helpful that my school district, it was one of their big initiatives, right? This was a 5th through 8th grade, very large initiative that they took on. And so it was something that was at the forefront for the district, and that helped a lot. If someone's trying to do this kind of on their own, the question always comes up, like, how do you convince an administrator, right? Or how do you convince other people to get on board? And sometimes I think it's just about trying it and seeing if it works. And then when something is really exciting, you can talk to other people about how excited you are about it. As I'm sure you can tell, I love to talk about this. So it wasn't difficult for me to go to someone and be like, let me tell you what I'm working on, and try to get them excited about it too. It has definitely been helpful as I've gone through my program at Ohio State to have professors that were supportive of what I wanted to study. But when you're passionate about something, it's fun to talk about. So how much access did the children have with technology? Okay, so also I was very blessed in this area. Our district had a 1-to-1 initiative, grades 7 through 12. So all of my students had Chromebooks. So I didn't, have to worry about getting blocking out the computer lab or something like that. They carried their Chromebooks with them all the time. But we are talking about 8th graders, so they weren't always charged, or they weren't, they were broken, or they forgot them, or all kinds of lovely things. But the cool thing about STEM is a lot of it is very, very collaborative. So it was something that took a long time for me to adjust to in terms of classroom management. That, loud didn't always mean they weren't working. Loud just sometimes meant it was loud and they were still talking about STEM. So they collaborated a lot. We also, because it was a STEM program, we did have grant money. So I was able to purchase like the virtual reality headsets. Like that was something that was really important to me. And it was something that I chose to use some of my funding on to have. But then it was also something that was shared. So then, I would have teachers say, hey, can I borrow the headsets today for this or this? And so that was another really cool talking point, and people were really excited about those. So very, very cool. Will you be working in the Palm Bay area? I'm honestly not super well versed in where the different universities are that I'll be working with the NASA program. I was sent probably 1,000 pages on Tuesday that I have to read over the next few weeks to prepare for my position. So that will come, but I'm honestly not quite sure yet. How did you finance the projects to places like Space Camp and the ocean? So that financing came from our school district. Part of that was, though, part of the grant money that we received for our STEM program. And then we also did fundraising. And we had some very gracious people who were willing to support the program. Both of these trips were completely funded, so the students did not have to pay. So any student that was involved in the STEM program was able to go. So to the ocean that year, we took 52. The program it was the first year the program had started, so it was pretty small. When we went to Space Camp, we took 95. So it grew quite a bit. And yeah, that was just part of the funding that we received for that program. But I will say that NASA does have grant opportunities. I know that. Because I have been a part of the teams that have evaluated some of those grants. So there's definitely grants out there that could help with those things. Space Camp, we were gone for 2 nights, where the ocean trip, we were only gone for the 1 night, and we stayed at the aquarium on the floor in front of the dolphin tank. Not the best night's sleep I ever got, but it was super fun. Economic level. So the district that I worked in is 100% free or reduced lunch. So extremely low income. Yeah, they qualify for free lunch or lunch and breakfast for every student in the district. Other questions? I didn't go to my last slide, which actually has my contact information on it, but I will put my email in the chat. If anyone has other questions, or if wanted to chat with me further about my experience with integrated STEM, or with what I'm doing at Ohio State, or what my future work will be, I do love to chat. So I would love to chat with you more.
Does this type of, it seems like this type of teaching really kind of goes with team teaching too, where teachers, math teachers and history teachers and those could work together in a classroom instead of being in separate classrooms like you did with your student teachers.
Yeah, so the issue that comes up is space, right? How can you fit multiple classes of kids in one room? The couple of times that we did that, where we did bring all of the students together like that, we would go to the gym, or we would go to the cafeteria. It wasn't something we could do kind of on the regular, for multiple, scheduling reasons and all of those things. But one of the ways that we were able to make this, because you're exactly right, it's most impactful if you can get a team of teachers to do it. And so one of the ways we made that work is we did have common planning time. And so we would choose different times of the year to do these overarching lessons that would go across all of these different projects and content areas. how did you do assessment? Okay, so assessment, I could probably do a whole presentation on assessment in STEM. It's difficult. It really is. We did not do, very rarely did we do like a paper pencil assessment in the STEM class. We did a lot of presentations. Some of those presentations were oral. Some of those presentations were, they were written, but they were written about whatever their product was. So one of the ones that's kind of sticking out is we did Lego models of plate tectonics. And so the students were asked to create these models over a couple of weeks as we like talked through the content they added to their model. And then their assessment was to do a written summary of what each part of their model represented and what that meant. And they could talk about the color, maybe they used a specific color to show the different layers, or maybe they, however they chose to do it. So I did use a lot of rubrics. But I'm glad you asked about student generated. So there were some times where I gave students the option, like, you tell me how you want to show me what you know. That takes a lot of time because they're all going to be different. But because they were group and collaborative projects, maybe I didn't have as many to grade, but there was different ways I had to evaluate them, right? So I had to assess them more on my observation of what they discussed sometimes if it was a group project, to make sure that all the students were understanding and not just like one or two kind of taking over the project. I only taught the class for 1 year. So I will say that there are things that had I had another year to do it, I would have maybe tried something new. Rubrics were really important to what I did. I gave the students the rubrics ahead of time. One of the assessments we did was about when we did plate tectonics and we talked about earthquakes. We bought a shake table, which is it's an electric table that you can change the settings to show seismic activity, and it like shakes back and forth. And then we were able to buy balsa wood that they created buildings. We attached them to the shake table, and then you could test them to see like whose building would last the longest. So they created those buildings, and then we tested them, and then they had to do a presentation to the class about why they chose the design that they chose, and what they had learned about earthquakes and the seismic waves that would, invite them to create the building the way that they did. Were the other discipline teachers involved in the projects involved in the evaluation? So that's a great question. And they did the evaluation for their content area. So we really did a lot of multidisciplinary, not interdisciplinary. So we still kind of all kept to our own content area in terms of evaluation, because it's what we were most comfortable with. Have the other teachers continued the activities since you left? Yes, I'm very happy to say that the STEM program is flourishing. This year has obviously been a little bit different for everyone. So they didn't get to take their trip last year, and they're not taking a trip this year, which is unfortunate, because that was something that we did Space Camp last year in December before everything happened, but they didn't get to take us. They're not taking a trip this year. But the elementary school has a STEM coordinator, and she does an amazing job with helping teachers to plan STEM activities. And they have two STEM teachers that float to the different classrooms, and the classroom teachers also help to facilitate these activities. So the primary school, the K-2 school, is actually the first designated STEM designated primary school in the state of Ohio. So they've done a really excellent job. So currently it's K-8. And then at the high school level, they've last been working on, there's a STEM honors diploma. And so that's something that they're working on. They can get it now, but they're trying to come up with a more systematic way of making that work. Other questions? Diane.
It's me again. I'm sorry. I just can't, just hearing you talk makes me want to be in your classroom.
Thank
So
you.
I can imagine the big vacancy that you have left or vacuum, just the enthusiasm that you portray now. I can see your students getting excited about science and technology and math and
Thank you.
and engineering. Yes. So
I was going to say, I just said, do you think you'll go back to the classroom? Because it seems to me that you would miss it.
I miss it terribly. I was also a coach. I coached swimming. And I miss it terribly. I was offered the opportunity last year to come back as like the secondary STEM coordinator, but it was a very much a part-time, like when I could come thing, because I was taking classes full-time at Ohio State. I also work at Ohio State, so that I can go to school there. So, it was something that I wasn't able to do. Like it was a full-time job I was trying to do in like 8 hours a week, which was not working out. I wasn't able to accomplish as much as I wanted to. So I honestly don't know the answer to that question. Working for NASA has been like my dream. And so I'm really excited to see what kind of impact I can make, from this new position. And then, I have my curriculum administration license, so that's something I've always kind of wanted to try too. So I don't know. I do know that education is where my heart is, and so and whatever impact I can make for students, I definitely want to keep doing that. I have students who are in that 8th grade STEM class that I taught who are now juniors, who reach out to me all the time and see how things are going. And because I announced to them, that end of that year that I was leaving. Of course, they were going on to the high school too, but it was an emotional experience, telling them that I was going to leave and not, because I like I said, I coached varsity swimming. So a lot of them would have eventually been athletes for me too. So yeah, it's definitely something I miss. But I'm also excited about what new impacts I might be able to make, and help teachers to make that connection between research and practice. I think it's a bridge that is hard to cross right now. It was something that I never really considered as a classroom teacher. I didn't have time. But there's a lot going on too with research and education that I would love to help make an impact there too.
If I can jump in there too. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I find it most interesting, and I've been retired now for quite a while, and I was starting to write a question, and then my question is basically one like, male versus female of your students. But I can think back to the time when I was teaching, which I've been gone for too long, but we always try to do things, I guess, in that where we worked in groups, and for a long time we even did like the whole language approach, where we didn't use like the reading textbook, and we were using the trade books and so on. So it's always important for the teachers to collaborate, and STEM has now just, I think it's on everyone's tongue. There was even a whole category on Jeopardy relating to STEM, and that's so very important. So I'm really glad to see that. But back to my question on male and female, how many of your students did you have that were, guys as well as girls?
Yeah, it was almost 50-50.
Really? That's good.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah. And I think what really helped me that year with that is a lot of the students that I had. So my husband teaches band, starting in the 5th grade. And so a lot of those students coming up were band students. And so like they had that connection with me that way. And they're like, yeah, we'll try STEM. I also think this idea of like project-based learning, which I didn't really speak to a whole lot, but especially for the groups of students, the students that signed up, that was something that was really important to them. They wanted this opportunity. I thought this idea that they were going to be with me for 2 hours every day, where they'd be like, I don't want to do that. But the way we presented it was, we need that 2 hours so we can do these projects, and we can do this background research that, we need to do, and these presentations and these, field trips and all these different things. And that really drew in a lot of students. It was about 50-50. It really was like 52% to 48% male, female.
It's your job at-home office, or is it going to be in a brick and mortar building, or do you have to relocate, or?
Yeah, so we get to stay right here in Southern Ohio. So the company or the department that I'm going to be working for is actually housed at the Glenn Research Center in Cleveland. But I really didn't want to move my family at least right now. And my husband teaches music, it can be hard to find music jobs. So anyway, it worked out best that we stayed here, and luckily the employer agreed. So for now, it'll be remote. They're still remote anyway. They're not back in the office either. But for now, we're gonna do it right from here. Any other questions?
Lindsay, we want to thank you for spending your evening with us. And I know the students who have had you will always remember you and will always remember the experiences they've had with you. And we just really look forward to what you'll have to report back to us. We want to hear from you again.
Oh,
And,
yeah, sure.
And we're excited to see where you're going and what you will be doing in the future.
Thank you.
So it has been so good to have you with us tonight, and thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Oh, anytime, anytime. And just a reminder for the rest of you ladies, if you haven't signed in yet for the attendance, go to chat, put your first and last name in your chapter and send it to everybody. If you want PDU credit, just send me an email. And I've gone to sending out one mailing a week because we have so many of you who show up on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm just sending both of those on Friday. So if you didn't get your Tuesday certificate already, it's coming. It will be on the way. Look for an e-blast from Kathy Tenney this weekend about next Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesday, we will have Make the Shift from Stress to Peace. Who cannot use that for sure? And then on Thursday, our very own Melody McGee will be the presenter, and she will be speaking on culturally teaching responsive environment to accommodate students' needs. So again, we have just had outstanding presenters and outstanding attendance, and I thank all of you. Diana, do you have anything you want to add?
No, just thanks everybody for coming, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey, Diana,
Yes.
it's Pam.
Yes. Hi, Pam.
Hey, I got a question for you. This is not about the program. I'm not for sure whether I'm